In the beginning of the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is, of course, in the final hours of his life before the cross, and the text will say that there are 2 days until Passover. There are 2 days, 2 24-hour periods of time, or 48 hours for him to go to the cross, and that's the title of this series, and save the world. Last time we looked at the last day before that, the Last Supper. And so it's not 48 hours, it's really just a few hours. And after the supper, some think maybe 10 or 11 o'clock that night, Jesus and the disciples go outside the walls of Jerusalem, and they gather there at the base of the Mount of Olives in a garden area called Gethsemane. And there Jesus will pray, and he'll give instructions to his disciples. His basic instruction is this: I want you guys to stay awake. That's the title of our message today. You have to stay awake. In the first service, I told everybody this is the one sermon you hear where you have to stay awake, So stay awake through this message. After 9/11, they launched this commission, the 9/11 Commission, to try to figure out how we knew so much about what was going to happen on 9/11, but didn't communicate it through various parts of our government in order to stop the event. Well, one of the things that they learned was the need for better communication. But the other was a rally around the idea that we needed vigilance. We needed to stay awake. We needed to be prepared. It is often said that Thomas Jefferson said, although if you go back and read it, most people say Jefferson never said this, that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. The cost of our freedom is that we have to constantly be ready. If that's true of freedom, that is also true of the Christian life. One of the things that Jesus will say in this passage to his disciples, as he did in the earlier chapter in the Olivet Discourse to everyone, is this message that we must stay awake. We must be alert, like the sentry on the wall. We have to continue to pay attention. We pick up in Mark 14 in verse 32 as Jesus will make his way to Gethsemane, and I want to begin to read to you from verse 32 to verse 42. It says, they went to a place called Gethsemane. As long as I can remember having heard this word, I've always thought it's one of the hardest words in the Bible to say. It's an old Aramaic word. It's actually 2 different words that when you put them together mean oil press. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John. We call these guys the pillars, the 3 inner disciples. He took them along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed. The word began to be gives us a sense that he's just starting this experience. And then there are 3 verbs that are used to describe the emotional state of Jesus here. One is it says he's deeply distressed. That communicates an intensity of emotion. And then it says, and troubled. And when I read this translation of the word and it says troubled, I'm a little troubled by that translation. And the reason is because if you were to look this word up in what's called a Greek lexicon, and especially the official lexicon, the first definition of this original word in the original language is to be in anxiety. And as far as I can tell, there's no English translation that translates it that way. In fact, I think most people, if they were to know that this passage describes Jesus in anxiety, might be it might cause them a little worry. Because a lot of us have heard the expression, certainly Jesus makes it, that we shouldn't worry. And yet here, Jesus is clearly anxious. Deeply anxious. This came to my attention a few years ago when I was reading through one of Max Lucado's books in which he began to talk about how in this gospel, Jesus in all his humanity is revealed as having that very human emotion that we experience. None of us can completely rid our lives of any kind of anxiety and worry. And certainly Jesus in this moment is deeply distressed and troubled. And he says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That word overwhelmed is the 3rd verb to describe Jesus' emotional state. It's one of grief or sadness. You could literally translate this, he was sad to death. The sense of what all was about to happen to him, the intense emotion of the moment, the heaviness, the anxiety, and then the grief. He said to them, stay here and keep watch. Now, he's already said that to the others. Now he's just saying that to the three. And it says in verse 35, going a little farther. So he's now going to be alone. He fell to the ground. In Luke's gospel, it says, with his face to the earth, with his face to the ground. And he prayed. He prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Notice the word hour, because Jesus is aware of the time. This whole series about 48 hours to save the world, Jesus is aware that the clock is ticking. He's aware of the time that is happening, and he senses it now with even greater sense of urgency and heaviness. He prays, if possible, the hour might pass from him. He says, Abba, Father. Abba is the Aramaic word that a young child would speak to their earthly father. Nowhere is it ever used of a person and God, except by Jesus. And he speaks to God as his Abba. It describes an intimate and personal relationship. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. That's a theological statement, isn't it? That he is an omnipotent God. God, you can do anything. Take this cup from me. If you're not familiar with the metaphor of the cup, earlier in Mark 10, Jesus had used it to describe his death. It is a picture of his death. It is a way of describing sometimes the cup of divine wrath or deliverance. Take this cup from me, meaning, I don't want to go to the cross. Don't make me. And then he prays, yet not what I want, not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples. Now remember, what he had given them an assignment to do was stay awake, pray. He returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. Now, before we're too hard on these disciples, remember they just had the Last Supper. It's probably 10 or 11 o'clock at night. In the midst of a Passover meal, a typical Jew would have had at least 4 glasses of wine. It would have been hard to stay awake. One commentator said if they'd have drank 40 cups of coffee rather than 4 cups of wine, it might have been easier. But still, even then, look what happens. Simon, he said to Peter. Interesting. He always calls him Peter, but here he calls him Simon. It's kind of like when you were a kid and you got in trouble and your parent called you by that other name, that name that they only called you when you're in trouble. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Like I can expect these other guys, but a little while ago you said, I will do this. Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? I mean, I gave you 60 minutes. There's not a preacher in the world that doesn't wonder that about some of their sermons. Can't you stay awake for 1 hour? You know, well, if the sermon lasts an hour, then you can't expect me to stay awake through the whole thing. Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? 60 minutes. The world is hanging in the balance. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The word temptation in the original language is the word parasmos. The word pyre is the word we get for fire. It means a fiery trial, a test that you go through. Never do we get the sense that God wants us to fail the test, but he'll give it to us anyway. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into this temptation. The spirit is willing. You talk a big game, Peter, but the flesh is weak. Once more, he went away and he prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. Have you ever had heavy eyes? You ever had that where you just kind of wish you could just kind of prop them open? It's just getting harder and harder to stay awake. They didn't know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? I mean, it's not enough that they're just sleeping. Now they've just kind of just given up. Enough. The hour has come. Isn't that interesting, the time? Jesus senses it. This is the moment. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. The place where all of this happens was in Gethsemane. In those days, Gethsemane was at the base of the Mount of Olives, covered in olive trees, until the Romans destroyed all those trees in 66 to 70 in the Great War. They came and they cut it all down. And today there's not as many. But if you go there, and I've been there a number of times, I can show you a picture here from a recent trip, one of my trips to Israel. I got to go into the Garden of Gethsemane, as I've done many times, and next to the public area is this private area, and you can see big towering trees, and the smaller little trees are some of the olive trees there. It is in a place just like this place that Jesus was. And this place, Gethsemane, is named for the oil press. And we can show you the picture of what an oil press looked like. You would take an olive and you'd put it into this thing, and through intense pressure, you could squeeze out the olive oil from it. The word that's used here to describe Jesus matches that language. And in the sense that as an olive is being squeezed, so Jesus is being squeezed. The translation of this word, deeply distressed, is the picture of horror that he's enduring. Luke 22:44 says he was in anguish. He prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like the drops of blood falling to the ground. If it really was sweat with blood in it, modern medicine knows this under the name hematidrosis. Blood in the sweat, basically, is what it means. Capillary blood vessels explode under intense pressure sometimes, and they can exude blood, which is a very rare but real condition. If that image is in your mind, hold that there, and then picture one of these olives as it's being broken open. We can show you the video. When I'm there, I've got one of these olives, and I start to break it open, and you can see what's on the inside of it, because it looks different than the kind of olives that you get when you go to the grocery store. Most of the time, the olive isn't like that, but you can see inside of one of these olives, there's this rich, reddish color, this sense of real connection between what Jesus is experiencing in the press of the moment and what they would have understood in the press there of the olive as it's being squished. The word here used for Jesus is troubled or anxious. Years ago, I mentioned to you that I had read about that in one of the books written by Max Lucado. In that book, one of the things Lucado does is he says, we don't like this picture of Jesus. We want Jesus to be, quote unquote, a stoic, like a Greek stoic, somebody who hides their emotions and goes through the experience as if he didn't feel anything at all. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus goes through this moment not stoically, but biblically. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a whole kind of literature called a lament or a lamentation that is a deep expression of one's feeling. Go read the Psalms, for example. They're not afraid to show their emotion, and Jesus in this moment is courageous enough to show his disciples how he actually feels on the inside. The intensity of his feeling is revealed, so much so that the gospel writers can write it down later, and Peter can tell Mark, hey, this is what I saw, and this is what I heard, and this is what I experienced. Jesus went through all of that. And then it says that he was sad. This word for grief is the same that was used when he got to the tomb of Lazarus, his dear friend. And when he saw him, the Bible says, John 11:35, the shortest verse in the English Bible, Jesus wept. And when he got to the tomb, it says that he doubled over in grief and pain. As he stood there over Jerusalem, he would weep in Luke 19:41 and in agony over the situation that was happening there. But the irony in all of this is that Jesus himself is going through this press. But he is going through this press like all trials and temptations, both for him and for us, that are modeled on the original temptation. The temptation in the garden, not the Garden of Gethsemane, but in the Garden of Eden. And in the very moment that Jesus began his ministry, remember how his ministry started? He got baptized, and then immediately he was taken into the wilderness, and he was tested or tempted by the devil. For 40 days he didn't eat, and then there were these 3 different temptations. Those temptations were not just at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. They went throughout his entire life, and here in the Garden of Gethsemane, these same temptations are right in front of him. And they're temptations that look eerily similar to the ones we face in life. As we go through them, first, there's the temptation to indulge. The temptation to indulge. Just like in the wilderness, the tempter came to Jesus, he said, turn these stones into bread, right? The temptation to indulge because you're hungry. You know, I can't help but think if any of us had the power that Jesus did, and we hadn't eaten, and we could have turned stones into bread, we would have been like, not only bread, give me a big piece of pizza. I mean, you're that hungry, why not a big hamburger? In other words, what Jesus is being tempted to do is something that none of us could likely do. It's the original temptation. It's the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with the forbidden fruit. That's the first temptation. It's that they're in the garden and it's, hey, you see this fruit. And I don't know if it was an apple or a fig or what kind of fruit it was. I guess it probably doesn't make any difference. But all of history hangs on the fact that they said, hey, doesn't it look good? Doesn't it taste good? Don't you want to try it? It's a temptation, natural temptation to indulge, to take on what looks good and sounds good. That's what the tempter does to Jesus in the wilderness when it says in Matthew chapter 4, verse 3, tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. When I see that word if, it takes me back like a flashback to my college days and my Greek class and Bruce Tankersley's elementary Greek at 8 a.m. My eyes were bleary from studying Greek because I had to get up at 5 to get ready for the quiz that'd be at 8. And I can remember Dr. Tank saying, whenever you see one of these ifs in the New Testament, you need to make sure you know what kind of a conditional clause you're dealing with. There's a first and a second and a third. And he pointed to this as an example of a first-class conditional. That means that the English translators should translate this as, since you are the Son of God. And it matters because the tempter is not coming to Jesus going, you know, if you are, he knows who he's talking to. Since you are the Son of God, since you have the power to turn bricks into bread, stone into bread, do it. You're hungry. Well, why not? Who's going to stop you? You've got the power to do it. Ever since I was a kid, I've had this picture in my mind from the children's Bible I use. We can put it here on the screen. This is that picture. I went and found it so you could show you like what picture I have of this moment. And I've often thought when I saw that picture as a kid, man, if the devil ever shows up and he looks like that, I'm not going to listen to him. He's red and he's got pointy things on his head and he's weird. I mean, nothing about that guy says, I want to listen to you. But the Bible tells us he doesn't show up looking like that. The Bible says he comes like a quote-unquote angel of light. He's not going to come saying, hey, look out for me, I'm scary. He's coming saying, don't you want to go ahead and do that? It's the temptation to indulge. But in this moment, Jesus is facing that. Do you not hear in his words? Take this cup. He's honest to God saying, take this from me. I don't want to go to the cross. But in the fire, in the test, in the trial, Jesus does end up following God's will. Listen to what he says. He says, yet not what I will, but what you will. And herein lies the secret to Jesus' ability to overcome his temptation. It was to surrender to the will of the Father. You know, a lot of times when we think about this scene of Jesus in the garden and Jesus praying, we get a picture like this in our mind. This was a very commonly described picture. You know, Jesus sort of in the garden, he's kind of sitting here, and there's kind of like this light coming from the sky, and you kind of imagine Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane like, you know, that couldn't have been that hard for him. He's Jesus. I mean, he just kind of glides through life, doesn't he? Does he even touch the ground? He's Jesus. He's got a halo over his head, after all, in a lot of those pictures. I mean, surely Jesus never got dirty or sweaty. He never had really any difficulty. And the author of the gospel paints a different picture, doesn't he? Jesus' face is in the dirt. You can taste the dirty soil of Gethsemane's garden. His face is soaking wet with sweat, and the skin is probably showing signs of this hematidrosis, this blood in his sweat. I mean, this is an agonizing moment. Tears deeply embedded in his face. He's a human. And the Gospels will not allow us to place him up on some kind of distant pedestal as if he didn't have all the humanity that we have. And we need to know Jesus in his humanity because the author of Hebrews says he was tested or tempted in every way, just as we are. But he passed those tests. He overcame those temptations. And therefore, he says, he's able to help us. He's able to help us because he was able to do it. He got through it. He did what Adam couldn't do and Eve couldn't do. He did what God wanted him to do. He was obedient to the will of the Father. But it's not the only temptation in the gospel. In the original scene of the temptation, when the tempter takes Jesus and takes him over to the edge of the temple and he says, jump off. He doesn't want him to hurt himself. He wants him to nearly hit the ground. He says, and then God's going to send angels in and he's going to rescue you, and everybody's going to go, wow, this guy really was sent from God. But the temptation is to show off. Isn't it interesting in the gospel that every time that Jesus does some spectacular miracle, he'll say something like this, clear the room. Peter, just you see this. James, John, you guys come up on the Mount of Transfiguration. There was always the temptation for Jesus to make a spectacle of it, to get the glory of the crowd, to give attention to what he did. Always the motivation of pride that's just beneath the surface of our humanity, our ego that wants to be stroked all the time. But Jesus resisted that. This is often expressed in our life through just natural human boasting. It's interesting that in the New Testament, when the apostle wrote the letter of Ephesians about salvation, he made in that famous statement, in that famous passage, this statement, it says in Ephesians 2:8, for it is by grace you've been saved. Everybody knows that. That's such a familiar verse. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith. But do you ever notice the next line? And this is not from yourselves. It's not about you. You didn't save yourself. You didn't even get yourself to the place where you could be saved. It is the gift of God. It's not by works. In fact, if it was up to you and me, we couldn't do it, and if we tried, we'd mess it up. So that no one can boast. None of us can come in here and go, well, I'm a better Christian than that person. No, you're not. You're a Christian like everybody else got to be a Christian. By the grace of God. You can only get there one way, and it is only if he gives you that gift. You have done nothing to attain it or achieve it, therefore you can't walk around and brag about how great you are at it. The people who were always wanting to do that in the Gospels are the nemesis of Jesus called the Pharisees. All they want to do is parade their religion as a spectacle in front of other people's eyes. And in the middle of his great Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, Jesus said, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Doesn't mean you don't do it in front of others. It means your motive matters. If you're just making a show of it, that's the wrong reason. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. Look at me, I'm doing great stuff for Jesus. As the hypocrites do in the synagogues on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received the reward in full. In other words, they got all that's coming to them. People are like, wow, aren't they great? But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. It's a kind of a saying, isn't it? So that your giving may be done in secret. Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, don't be like hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward. And all of those, the issue is the motivation, not the action. Praying in front of other people is great, but to be motivated by the desire to show off, well, that appeals to that sinful nature that lies just beneath the surface. And Jesus doesn't do that. And then And finally, the temptation there in the wilderness was a temptation to bow before him. Bow before me, I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. It was a temptation that ran throughout Jesus' ministry. He was tempted to self-glorify. The temptation to glorify yourself is still a human temptation, isn't it? I mean, who of us doesn't want to be recognized in some way? In the gospel, this becomes the pivotal and penultimate temptation of Jesus. It happens in the midpoint of Mark's gospel. It happens in the Mark 8 scene where the disciples go with Jesus, and only 3 of them eventually, but all of them initially are asked the question about who he is at Caesarea Philippi. In Mark 8:29, it says, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter said, "You're the Messiah. You're the King." Boy, that's an honorific title. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. You see, he's not trying to show off. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law. He must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside. And he began to rebuke him. And when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Notice what he says. Notice what he says. "Get behind me, Satan." Why does he say that? Because the temptation comes from him. It is the temptation of Jesus to not go to the cross, to take the title king and to glorify himself. And he says to Peter, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human. You have in mind the will of men, not the will of God." And there he is in Gethsemane with his face in the dirt, his disciples snoring over there, the weight of the world on his shoulders, wrestling with the greatest struggle of life. And he prays, "Take the cup, yet not what I want, but what you want." And you can almost audibly hear the surrender. Once again, he's overcome the trial and the temptation by choosing to do what the Father wants him to do, by letting go of what he wants. Inside of all of us is a battle. It's a Romans 7 kind of battle of the wills. The Bible, and especially Paul, spends a lot of time talking about the spirit and the flesh. Jesus refers to it in this passage, that there is within us a humanity, a flesh that is at war within ourselves. We don't even necessarily need the quote-unquote devil to make us do it. Our own sinful nature can lead us down that path. But in this battle, the greatest danger, like 9/11, is to not realize that there's a real enemy, to not know that the enemy seeks to kill, steal, and destroy, to not know that you're at war with a real enemy, that you wage a war with not flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly realms, that there is a spiritual war going on right now for your soul. It's easy for us to walk through life spiritually asleep at the switch to the reality of what's actually happening in our own hearts and our own lives. As the disciples' eyes are heavy and closed to this reality, Jesus's are wide-eyed and aware of the battle. And what's at stake is not just for himself and not just for them, but it's for you and me and for the entire world. His message is, you have to stay awake. Let's pray. Father, my prayer today is for us to peel back the veneer, to see with clear eyes the reality that we are in the midst of a spiritual battle in this life. That at stake in all of our lives is more than just the immediate circumstances. There's a bigger picture. There's another realm in which this is happening. God, would you open our eyes to the reality of the spiritual battle that is happening in our world, in our lives? And Lord, would you today awaken us? Would you awaken the church in a world that is in desperate need of the gospel of Jesus Christ, where there are millions and millions and millions of people who are living in spiritual darkness, who need the light of Christ? God, would you awake the sleeping, slumbering giant that is your church in America? And Lord, as I always pray for that revival to come to this nation and pray for it to come to this state and to come to our communities, I pray, as I always do, Lord, that it would begin in me and would begin in our church and would begin in each of us individually today, that you would awaken in us a spiritual hunger and desire that your will would be accomplished in our lives and in our land. God, use us today as you wish, as you will. Thy will be done. In Jesus' name.